More than 60 women and children and at least 20 men killed in the latest NATO raids on a Libyan village, says Gaddafi's regime. The Western military alliance still insists it's only targeting military centres. How has Gaddafi managed to stay in power months since the air raid started? Are we being told the true story behind the Libyan war? Stay tuned to another edition of News Analysis with me, Homar Leski.
Residential buildings reduced to rubble by a NATO airstrike in the Libyan city of Zlitan, 150 kilometers east of the capital, Tripoli. Libya says scores of people, including women and children, have died in the latest NATO air attack on a village near Zlitan, what the military alliance has rejected. NATO says there is no evidence showing civilians have been killed in its bombardment.
This was a military facility, clearly, with two huge agricultural buildings that were occupied by Gaddafi forces.
NATO has repeatedly said its operations in Libya are aimed at protecting civilians against forces loyal to a longtime ruler, Muammar Gaddafi. In the past, NATO has boasted of using precision-guided weapons with an accuracy of a few meters in Libya.
They were innocent people, men, women and children. They all died. My 2-year-old daughter and entire families who came here from other areas, they came all the way here to escape the bombings and from the airstrikes. 20 families are dead, children and women, all of them innocent people.
Libyan state television has frequently aired footage of civilians killed or injured in NATO attacks since the war began. NATO airstrikes have not spared the revolutionaries fighting the Gaddafi forces either. Many of them have so far lost their lives in NATO attacks. The revolutionaries have on several occasions protested the bombardment of their positions by NATO warplanes. The Western military alliance insists that its mission in Libya is to help Libyans materialize their legitimate aspirations and topple the Gaddafi regime. Yet many observers believe that Libya's oil is the real reason.
Well, let's get more now from Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian in Washington, Mr. Majer Saloom, human rights activist in Beirut, and John Rees with the Stop the War Coalition in London. Welcome to News Analysis, and I'll start with Mr. Rees in London. What's causing the growing number of civilian casualties, Mr. Rees? 85 killed in one NATO attack today in one incident. Isn't there precision targeting? Isn't there, according to NATO, guided targets towards, of course, military centres?
Yes, well, of course, we don't know the truth about this particular incident. I doubt if it's been verified by journalists because they're restricted in their reporting in Libya. But it's, in general, inconceivable that you can have an air bombardment of the kind that NATO has been carrying out in Libya without there being civilian casualties. And we certainly do know, as your report suggested, that NATO bombing has even hit the rebel positions and caused casualties amongst them. It was been clear since the very beginning of this military operation that NATO was not going to restrict itself to the business of enforcing a no-fly zone or indeed simply of protecting civilians. It's fighting a war, and it's fighting a war for the removal of Colonel Gaddafi from power. It's fighting yet another war for regime change, and we've seen both in Iraq and in Afghanistan exactly what the talk of precision-guided weapons means. There is no such thing as a precision-guided weapon that can avoid civilian casualties, and that's exactly what's coming to light in Libya, just as it was proved to be the case in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All right, let's go to Mr. Tarpley now in Washington. Mr. Tarpley, I guess there in London, Mr. Rees is saying that, well, we can't confirm a lot of the news that is coming in from Libya, either from the Libyan regime, from the anti-Gaddafi fighters. On the one side, NATO is saying that it's hitting command and control centres, military facilities, weapons dumps, rocket launchers. On the other hand, Libyan officials are saying that residential areas are being targeted. How can we make that distinction? How can we get the true news from Libya?
Well, NATO, of course, are famous liars. I myself have visited Libya. I visited a compound of the Al-Qaeda family, 70 kilometers west of Tripoli. It was purely residential. It included a petting zoo. I personally inspected it. I looked into every doorway and into every basement that I could reach. There was nothing military about it. And there the toll was at least 3 women, 4 children, a Sudanese cook, and some other people. So NATO is simply lying. But on the larger question, how does this civil war go on? I think the big news of the past 24 hours is the chaos of the Benghazi rebel government. And this grows out of the assassination of Commanding General Yunus about 10 or 12 days ago now. You have to imagine a country where the vice president, and in that case that would be Essawi, had joined with the defense minister, Dugaili, and they had joined with a disgruntled general, Khalifa Hifter, he happened to be a CIA agent who had lived in Northern Virginia for 20 years. Those 3, the vice president, the defense minister, and the disgruntled but ambitious general, get together and arrange the assassination of the commanding general of the armed forces. And the agency that carries out the assassination is the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, meaning Al-Qaeda, because I take it that's exactly who the February 18th Martyrs Brigade is. That's called democracy. That government is now in chaos. They're trying to patch that up. I don't think they will.
All right, Dr.
They may have a civil war within a civil war.
If I could just stop here, because you referred to the killing of the general commander, and that is a top issue that we're going to discuss in the course of the program. But first, I'd like to go to Beirut, Mr. Majer Saloom. Mr. Saloom, just speaking of what NATO is doing in Libya first, before we go to the issue of civil war in Libya, Mr. Rees telling us that what NATO is after is regime change in Libya, but it hasn't been able to do that since it started the air raids. What is taking the NATO forces so long to achieve anything in Libya?
Well, I mean, let me be a military analyst first. If you recognize with my colleagues now in Washington or in London, I mean, the past airstrikes by the NATO have been decreasing a bit. So lately, just like today, and the casualties we've witnessed today on your press TV, as I've seen, so many casualties between women and children, and this is not tolerated by us as human rights activists, whether we are in Lebanon or in Europe or in the States. Now, vis-a-vis the whole plan by the West or the conspiracy today, as I have analyzed so far, the whole situation is to cut down, the forces by the rebels, the TNC or the Transitional National Council, and never, dismiss the whole idea of assassination. I do agree with my colleague Webster from Washington, D.C. The whole situation by assassinating such a general, and he was the Minister of the Interior of the regime itself, Gaddafi forces back then. Now they're trying to balance between both forces, between the East and the West. And the whole plan, to me, as I analyze it, is to have 2 independent states within one state, which is Libya. And the whole interest is to cut down the Libyan forces and minimize its forces, actually the Gaddafi forces, and include another army or a minimal army of the TNC or the Transitional National Council, headed by Mustafa Abdul Jalil. Hence, for them to let them invest for the oil and gas tanks, whether they are, or millions of barrels that are within the lands of the Republic of Libya today.
Okay, John Rees in London, how viable do you see these kinds of claims when you say that NATO is after regime change? How do you see the comments being made there by our guest in Beirut?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that the oil resources, the natural resources of Libya are an important issue for the Western powers, although it has to be said that they'd struck deals with the Gaddafi regime itself over these issues. So I don't see that as the only important issue at stake for NATO. Actually, I think even more important than the oil resources was the desire to intervene in the process of the Arab revolutions and to try and get some control over their spread. Of course, the military intervention in Libya happened at exactly the same time as the military intervention by Saudi Arabia in Bahrain, and we know that intervention was sanctioned by Robert Gates just a couple of days, the US Secretary of State, just a couple of days before it took place. So I look on the military interventions sanctioned by the US on the part of Saudi Arabia into the Bahrain revolution and the military intervention into Libya as part of a single package designed to give the major powers some foothold in the fast developing Arab revolutions, to try and draw a line under them, to try and get control, which I think to a large degree they've been successful in doing, to get control of the rebel forces in Libya, to make them vassals of to make them dependent on the Western powers. And I think it's precisely that dependency which has produced the splits and the weaknesses and the divisions within the TNC that we've seen so graphically in recent weeks.
Right, and just referring to those divisions, Dr. Tarpley in Washington, you were referring there in your earlier remarks about that exact case. And let's talk about the relation that the NATO forces, especially the United States, has had with these anti-Gaddafi forces. A lot of observers saying that they are linked to Al-Qaeda, that there is a secret collision between the United States and Al-Qaeda, a marriage of convenience in some people's words. How do you see this relationship now that the issue of civil war is being raised? Is that something that NATO was prepared to confront?
Well, the rivalry appears to have been between Yunus, who had been a minister in Gaddafi's governments and a longtime associate of Gaddafi, sort of internal opposition, and then this guy Hifter, Khalifa Hifter or Haftar in various English renderings. That was the person who had lived in Northern Virginia, darling of the CIA, darling of the Pentagon, and had gone back. So there'd been a conflict between Yunus and Hifter. The reports were that the Yunus people were trying to call in NATO strikes on Hifter, and Hifter would respond by using his better connections to call in NATO strikes on the other side. So this is totally chaotic. The embarrassment growing out of this political assassination with the help of Al-Qaeda is so great now that the Norwegians have dropped out completely as of August 1st. Norway, which was 10% of the bombing effort, has dropped out. The Dutch, the Netherlands are still there, but they refuse to bomb. Canada will drop out next month. Berlusconi of Italy says that he was forced into this by the United States, by Obama and Hillary Clinton, and by President Napolitano of Italy, an old communist, interestingly enough, and by the votes of the neo-communists in the Italian parliament. Here in the United States, we've got a 15-vote margin in the House of Representatives. If 15 votes flip the other way, the House of Representatives will cut off funding for this. And now that you've mentioned Al-Qaeda, we here in Washington, D.C. have an Al-Qaeda base. And the Al-Qaeda base has been created by the State Department. The Libyan embassy on Virginia Avenue, close to the Watergate complex, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Key Bridge, and the Whitehurst Freeway, right in the middle of all that, there's now an Al-Qaeda base because the Libyan Rebel Council, the Benghazi gaggle of Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Al-Qaeda have taken over the building. So here in Washington, we're at grave danger compared to what we were before.
Mr. Majer Saloom, is there a covert relationship between the United States and Al-Qaeda in Libya? What's your take on that?
It could be, but I do not have enough proof tonight or anywhere right now. But I believe I believe when what Mr. Webster have been saying in Washington does have a parallel. Say, what do I have to say now is that the Al-Qaeda have a mutual interest in cutting or in hurting or in bringing down the TNC inside Benghazi, as we have witnessed the assassination of Abdul Fattah Yunus, the major commander of the TNC inside Benghazi, or the east, let's say, parts of Libya today. Now,